further, take a step back. When we say since its inception, ultimately the critical steps along the way and why this is now such a big deal. Take a look.
And liftoff at dawn, the dawn of Orion.
8 years ago, we covered and witnessed the test flight of the Orion spacecraft. This was our first step in taking us back to the moon. And now with Artemis 1 named after Apollo's twin sister, we're taking the next big leap. The new super rocket called the Space Launch System will blast the Orion spacecraft on its path to the moon.
We're going to stress it and test it. We're going to make it do things that we would never do with a crew on in order to try to make it as safe as possible.
After Artemis 1, Artemis 2 will fly astronauts in orbit around the moon, as Apollo 8 did. And then Artemis 3, like Apollo 11, will send astronauts back to the lunar surface.
And when you're developing new technologies, you're pressing the edge of the envelope, you're really doing things for the first time. And although we have been to the moon before, there are new technologies, new spacesuits that we're developing.
NASA's also developing a rest stop in lunar orbit called Gateway. Here astronauts will eventually dock the Orion and steer Gateway to the South Pole, then hop on a lunar lander to the ice loads. And that's a big part of what inspired our plans to go back to the moon and this time to stay. In 2008 and 2009, NASA probes discovered hundreds of millions of tons of ice beneath the surface. Ice like we have here on Earth. Because remember, scientists say the moon was part of ancient Earth until a massive collision broke it off. And on the moon, these green dots mark the motherlode of ice, which means water to drink, and the makings of air to breathe and rocket fuel to Mars.
It's one thing 3 or 4 days to the moon and then to return humans. It's another thing to go millions and millions of miles all the way to Mars. And once you're on the surface, you're there for a year or two until the planets realign so that they are closer so that you can get back within about 10 months. We've got to develop all kinds of new technologies. And that's the excitement of this program. Back to the moon and then on to Mars.
And keep in mind, when we went to the moon and first landed astronauts on the moon in 1969, it was a very different part of it. Again, our focus will be on the South Pole, where those discoveries of loads of ice happen to be, at least in the greatest percentage. And with that, it requires new spacesuits because there are additional dangers, exposures in that part of the moon. There also have to be additional surveys. We have to determine an exact landing spot. Roughly 12 have been identified. But while all of that is playing out, you also have to test the safety of the spacecraft. And as we showed, it has been launched once before, but never sent all the way to the moon. So that's where we'll take it in laps around the moon and then bring it back. And also in testing its re-entry, you need to make sure that it will hold up both going and coming. And that is when we'll continue work on the SpaceX spaceship that will take astronauts, shuttle them eventually from that gateway down to the surface of the moon, the new spacesuits. The list goes on and on of technology that is still in development at this time. This is a safety test to make sure that we're going in the right direction. And once we pass that test, then on to Artemis 2, Artemis 3 when we first land. And by the way, we'll break another barrier with the first person of color and the first woman on the moon. And then future Artemis missions, Artemis 4, Artemis 5, and beyond, that will begin the work of the colonization. And in the coming year, NASA is also going to start developing payloads, and we'll begin launching equipment that will be landing on the surface of the moon. So all of this is tremendously exciting. When you compare it to the Apollo missions of the 1960s, well, that was about winning the Cold War. Ultimately, we did a couple of decades later, showing that we were superior than the Soviet Union in pursuits of space and landing on the moon and doing huge things, very important in helping the world understand our can-do spirit and our know-how, and in maneuvering through the balance of power in the world at that time. It also delivered the age of the miniaturization of electronics. It hastened development of new technologies that led to GPS, the internet. The list goes on and on. And while all of that is extraordinary in terms of what we accomplished, the potential of Artemis is so much greater. We're no longer in the same kind of geopolitical contest. We're now en route, not just to the moon, but to use that as a launching pad to Mars and then far beyond.
Craig, all of the goals you laid out there as you showed us that piece are just incredible and fantastical to think about, that this can be reality. And everything we've seen so far has shown us that it is possible. And we're going to break that down in just a moment. I want to update everyone on where we stand now with the original 1:04 a.m. launch window passing, as we are in a hold now. Just the latest tweet from NASA says that they are in a replenish mode, and I can't parse a lot of this space terminology they use for launching a rocket, but they're in replenish mode on upper stage for both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and they remain in a hold. So as we wait on that, and as we at this time are still understanding that NASA intends to launch the rocket within this 2-hour launch window, which would ostensibly close around 3:04 a.m., let's talk about the overall Artemis mission as you just presented it there, phase 1, 2, and 3. Let's focus on 1 now. This one here, as we've touched on, this is an uncrewed capsule. As we look at the rocket itself, we see the stages there and the orange tank, which is built on space shuttle technology, the same technology that was used for the shuttle mission. And at the top we see there, sitting atop it, is the Orion spacecraft. And as you touched on, Craig, this will be its first real test. They took it for a test flight into lower orbit in 2014, but this mission will put stresses on it that it has never had in a real environment before. And for that reason, they will have a mannequin in the commander's seat there. A mannequin, by the way, named after Arturo Campos, who of course helped the Apollo 13 crew return to Earth. Right. That mannequin is equipped with various sensors, radiation sensors, instruments in the seat to measure acceleration, vibration data. Now we see the view there of the spacecraft itself. This spacecraft will fly some 1.3 million miles during this mission. It's incredible to think about. And Craig, I want to talk to you about the time frame of this mission, because NASA has said this will take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. Why do we see such a range there?
Well, this, if it launches this morning, tonight or this morning, depending on how you look at it, it would take 26 days. So it would splash back in 26 days. There is a variance depending on when it launches, when it comes back. Why is that? It relates to the position of the moon in relation to the Earth in terms of how long the mission will last. First off, they choose these particular windows to make sure that alignment is in place. You can't engineer a particular flight path and then launch at a time when the moon is not in the same location relative to Earth. So that's why they're limited. That's why you'll get these launches sometimes in the wee morning hours. 1. 2, you also have solar arrays on the Orion, so it depends in part, not fully, but in part on solar power. So you want to make sure that the path it takes, it has the maximum exposure to sunlight. That figures into it as well. And then what happens after 26 days? Well, after 26 days, it comes splashing back to Earth, at which point recovery engineers will then go to work and retrieving it like we did in the Apollo era. Well, what do those recovery engineers want? They want daylight. They don't want to be doing this in the middle of the night as it currently is. Therefore, all of that figures into how long, first off, when you launch, and 2, when you bring it back. And that's why there can be some variance in the number of days this actually takes flight before it splashes back. It's a very complicated equation with a lot of variables that NASA certainly figures into it. One other point, you mentioned also the fact that this relies on legacy technology from the shuttle era. It certainly does. It, to a certain extent, does Apollo as well. At least it borrows elements from it. So when this launches, when you see it, from what we're told by NASA engineers and retired engineers at NASA, this will likely resemble a space shuttle flight for those of you who have seen those flights in years past before the shuttle program was retired. And it also will have some components of Apollo as well. It's basically a blending of the two technologies and platforms, but with another critical difference too, in that there are many more computers on this particular system that will make it easier to navigate. Much more will be automated than it was in the olden days of our space pioneers in the 1950s and in the 1960s. One critical difference, it's how you can have a more powerful rocket, the most powerful rocket that's ever built, that's technically slightly smaller than the Saturn V rocket, which first took us to the moon in the 1960s. So when this goes off, again, it will resemble, not entirely, but resemble the space shuttle. And also, once we get that, we have a launch window, but when we get an actual launch time, which should be coming momentarily, keep in mind, if you're watching this in the Tampa Bay area, as we all are, once you see it launch on your television screen or on your computer screen, you need to wait, most people, 30 to 40 seconds from the point of liftoff before you can then see it in the sky, assuming that there's no obstructions from buildings or clouds, what have you. That's for most of Tampa Bay, but of course, as you head east, Poinciana, for example, might be more like 20 seconds or so.
Right.
It really depends on how west or far away you are from the point of launch.
Yeah, and we remain in hold on waiting to hear when the launch might take place. The last update we got just a few seconds ago, Craig, as you were talking, is that they are testing. There was an issue earlier tonight, as you touched on, with one of the radars there on the range. The radar that's used to test, or they used to track the rocket as it's in flight. They had an issue with an Ethernet cable, and there was some replacement of that cable, and now they are testing that radar to make sure it's working. Originally, when this problem surfaced around 11:30 p.m., they said that this test might take 70 minutes to complete. We don't know exactly when they started testing it, but that may give us an idea of what time we could be looking at here, depending on if the test started within the past few minutes. The rocket you mentioned there, Craig, this is the first test of the SLS. It's the Space Launch System rocket. It's been under development for 11 years now. And again, the most powerful rocket in the world. The four main engines it uses are, we talked about this a moment ago, they are also recycled from that shuttle program, part of the shuttle legacy. And this rocket will produce 15% more thrust than the Saturn V rocket, because this entire apparatus weighs some 6.8 million pounds. So you think about the thrust to get that off of the Earth and into Earth's lower orbit. It's going to be a tremendous sight and a tremendous moment when it does happen. This has been a long time coming, though, and once this does happen, we're going to see Orion, the spacecraft. Of course, during various stages of this launch, it will detach from the core there. And once the spacecraft begins its journey, ultimately, as we said earlier, reaching the moon in some 5 or 6 days, it's going to skim very close to the surface. And along this isn't just one experiment. This spacecraft also has several small satellites on board that it's going to deploy throughout this journey here. And some of those satellites are going to perform other tests. And one of them is going to attempt the smallest landing of a lunar module on the surface of the moon as it gets near the moon. It's just incredible how close this spacecraft will skim some 62 miles above the surface of the moon before it ultimately shoots past the moon about 40,000 miles. That will be the farthest any spacecraft designed to carry man has traveled into deep space. And then when we get to Artemis 2, we have a crew. We have a manned spacecraft, a woman spacecraft too. And that will be, again, the farthest that a spacecraft has traveled into deep space, looping around the moon and ultimately making its way back to Earth. Then you get to Artemis 3. That's where, as your piece touched on earlier, Craig, they almost do a little shuttle transfer there in the lunar orbit, and they make their way down to the surface of the moon.
We have an update, too. On top of that, we're hearing a tentative launch is going to be at 1:45 a.m. That's not locked in, but that may be what we're looking at here. So keep in mind that the issues, the glitches, including the Ethernet cable, the Ethernet switch that needed to be replaced, may have cost some time. Certainly the leaking valve on the mobile launch platform was an issue as well. all of this didn't foreclose on the launch tonight. It looks as if we're still a go, but it pushed things back from 1:04 a.m. To presumably, at this point, tentatively 1:45 a.m. And that gives us a little more time to flesh this out, and some of you more time to wake up. Don't go to bed by any stretch here. Chris was just talking, if you just joined us, about some of the experiments on the Artemis 1 mission. There will be many other experiments as well. Much of that is put together at Kennedy Space Center and other NASA laboratories from Huntsville, Alabama. The list goes on across the nation. There are some 70,000 jobs tied just to the Artemis program. And keep in mind, it's not just NASA engineers working on these components for the spacecraft and the rocket itself or for its payload and its experiments. It also is a whole range of contractors, defense contractors, aerospace contractors, and certainly educational institutions, which would take us into USF, to UCF as well, that are very involved in elements not just for Artemis 1, 2, and 3, but for future missions as well. That has a big impact on our economy. My goodness, look at what the Apollo program, Mercury before that, did for Central Florida, how it helped this area grow, how it delivered an infusion of young families who were hungry for family entertainment, which gave rise to the demand that delivered the theme park industry and so many other destinations we have. It played such a huge role in building our economy and also feeding it with high-paying jobs and feeding, the list goes on, supermarkets like Publix, which were in their infancy in Lakeland, and allowed it to spread. Winn-Dixie in North Florida. And that's an example of how the space program in the early days totally transformed Central Florida. Well, think about this. Maybe not to the same extent that we saw during Apollo. That was certainly unique, and Florida has grown by leaps and bounds since then. We don't know that it will, and likely won't, transform the state of Florida in the same way, but it will absolutely deliver many, many jobs and a lot of high-paying jobs for our economy. And that's where this will have a multiplier effect, where it will deliver tremendous dividends for the aerospace industry through Tampa Bay. And by the way, the Space Coast leads from Titusville all the way through Orlando and tracks west into our area as well, but not just the contractors, but also the educational institutions as well. The list goes on in terms of how this ultimately contributes to a lot of people's paychecks as we speak, and many others yet to come.
I want to repeat what you said a moment ago, the update from NASA, Craig, that the launch time, we are within the window, but the launch time is now at 1:45. That's what NASA is looking at now. So we are some 24 minutes away from that momentous moment happening now after they've worked out some kinks that popped up. And this is what happens with these kind of high stakes mission. Caution is at a premium when you have so much on the line. Let's talk about what we will see once the launch does happen. Of course, we've watched many of these launches. It's a pastime here in Florida, and for many space watchers around the globe, we know that when the rocket takes off, there will be a separation of those two booster rockets you see right there on the side. That will happen some 3.5 minutes into flight. Some 8.5 minutes into flight, we will see the main core there disengage from the upper stage area of the rocket there. I find this interesting, Craig, because we've seen a lot of these SpaceX launches off of the Space Coast there at Kennedy Space Center in the last couple of years, where SpaceX obviously has developed the technology to recover those boosters. And it was thrilling, of course, to be able to actually see in real time them landing remotely these boosters back on a barge. That isn't happening with any of these components. None of these components are recoverable. The rocket boosters, the smaller rockets there on the side, will fall into the Atlantic. And as the rocket makes its path around the curvature of the Earth, the core stage rocket, the large one there, will actually fall into the Pacific. So that is remarkable when you think about the two sides of the United States will be involved in this in some way, in parts of this mission happening. I
believe the original plan for Artemis 1 was in 2016. and this was something that was announced during the Obama administration, and it got pushed back time and time again. And one of the reasons was that the SLS rocket got pushed back due to glitches and delays in developing it. And to your point that it does not, the boosters do not return to Earth as they were, and that the design for this is a bit of a legacy technology at this point, it did face some controversy in the course of years worth of glitches, setbacks, and delays. And with those came significant cost overruns. So there has been some controversy with the SLS rocket because it does not, and the entire system does not include some of the same technologies. So there were questions that have been raised by space enthusiasts and some scientists in terms of was it the right decision to stick with the SLS. Administrator Bill Nelson, who had expressed criticism in years past as a member of the Senate, absolutely stuck with it. He says we're seeing the payoff tonight, and that the payoff in other companies like SpaceX with their technologies are now able to do much of the business in low Earth orbit, while NASA can concentrate on a much more powerful rocket. While it may not have the same capabilities in terms of returning upright to Earth, it has capabilities to send astronauts farther than they have ever been sent. As we will see, in fact, with Artemis 1, though it is unmanned, as you mentioned, it's running laps around the moon once it launches, but also going far beyond in those loops than we previously have. You combine the technology, the computer technology, with far more powerful rockets. Ultimately, that's where Administrator Nelson says we will see the payoff of the SLS, despite the overruns and the controversy that we saw in the early years of the program. It was focused on issues of designing the rocket. Well, they say that stands to reason. You had similar issues in developing the Saturn V, because this is something that is extraordinarily difficult to engineer, and though we have been to the moon before, they're developing technologies with bolder ambitions that take us beyond that, which figures into what have been the overruns and the delay. But it does take us ultimately on a path some 10 years in the making. If you just joined us and missed our introductory segment, where this will take us is to the moon, first with an unmanned test launch of Artemis 1, then Artemis 2, flying astronauts around the moon, and then Artemis 3, which was originally set under the Trump administration in 2024, that has since been pushed back to 2025, conceivably 2026, we'll see, but for now, 2025, to land the first woman and person in color back on the surface of the moon as another proud achievement of our nation and our space program, but as the next stepping stone to developing a permanent presence on the moon. Why would we want to have a permanent presence on the moon? We thought at one point it was just a cold, dead, dusty rock, and that's why we ultimately phased out the Apollo missions, did Nixon, and move us to the space shuttle era to focus on the revolution that took us through the age of the internet and satellites, etc. But in 2008, 2009, probes discovered there were loads of ice, moon water, that we can now use, that we can mine. You get water out of ice in space on the moon by electrolyzing it. And with that, you do that with solar power. And then in doing that with solar power, you can convert that into water and air, which can sustain life for the colonists, not just the astronauts, but the colonists. But you can also use it, convert it to steam, rocket fuel, which can then take us far beyond. So you then go from Earth ultimately to Gateway, the space station or mini space station around the moon, on a SpaceX ship, down to the surface, to the colony, where you mine the water, ultimately build a launching pad to Mars, and then off you go.
Incredible stuff there. And as the technology advances, as you pointed out, so do the possibilities. We are less than 18 minutes away now from that 1:45 a.m. launch window, the new launch window set by NASA. Craig, you talked about earlier all of the industries that the space industry and that this mission itself has supported, the thousands of jobs created and that have gone into this, and also in Florida creating a huge research community where universities have poured so much into educating and teaching researchers that can support the space industry. And one reason that the launch was scrubbed a couple of months ago was because of a hydrogen leak in a propellant tank. There's research being done now at the University of Central Florida to keep that kind of problem from hampering future missions. And that's where we find Fox 13's Evan Axelbank with more on that.
Stopping a 300-foot rocket from failing happens inch by inch.
It feels good to be hands-on.
Square by square.
So now we have our layers. We can assemble them into our panel now.
And degree by degree.
And what we're left with is a ceramic matrix and a ceramic composite able to withstand some really high temperatures.
They hope. This is one of the mechanical and aerospace engineering labs at UCF. It's run by Dr. Jan Go.
This is the biggest project I have ever had before.
He's guiding a team of students who are trying to figure out how to stop a hydrogen leak, like the one that grounded Artemis on September 3rd and cost the mission 2 months.
You're here for science, you're here to learn, you're here to find out new things that you didn't know before, to apply the knowledge that you have to discover something new.
We watched as they cured a composite tile, similar to what would be used on a space rocket, by subjecting it to pressure 17 times higher than sea level and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it goes under acetylene and 6,000 degrees.
They're traditionally used for cutting steel. Heated up to a temperature that's similar to what it would see in a hydrogen combustion turbine.
So essentially we're measuring how much heat gets through the sample into the back.
The less heat that gets through, the better the sample is working, and the closer they are to stopping leaks that can scrub a mission that has worldwide attention.
This is very, very good research that has the potential to really advance society and potentially save lives.
Today, the experiments went as planned. You can see that the material that was exposed to the high heat looks a lot like what they started with. The lab recently won a grant from the Department of Energy that will allow them to use this technology to study not just rocket science, but the future of hydrogen power.
Hydrogen fuel is pretty much the future. It's clean, the only emissions are just water. So it's a very important fuel to be researching. These turbines are very important also, for aerospace, but also for, powering our homes, for powering our vehicles.
Including ones that are headed back to the moon. Seeing super slow-mo HD video shows how every detail on ships with millions of parts are the difference between success and failure.
We all kind of have that shared drive to learn new things and continue to progress not only our own personal knowledge, but the knowledge of society and current developments.
Their findings won't be on the next launch, but sometime soon, you might look up in the sky at the Big Bird and know what started as a lab fire in Orlando might end up on the moon.
Pretty incredible. Fox 13's Evan Axelbank there, along with UCF. The University of Miami is also involved in this work. They're working to test the very high temperatures that ceramics can withstand so that the ceramics could be used to coat the inner portions of those chambers that contain the hydrogen. And that's expected to be a 2-year project, but it would be used in future missions like we were seeing here today with Artemis. So heat is necessary to test chambers that hold hydrogen. Craig, heat also necessary to test the structure of Orion as it makes a re-entry and again, we're awaiting this 1:45 a.m. Is the new launch time, 1:45 a.m. But Orion's re-entry, and again, you mentioned this mission will take about 26 days. When it comes back into Earth's atmosphere, it will do so at a speed not attained by a spacecraft before, at some 25,000 miles per hour. 25,000 miles per hour when it hits the atmosphere. That's 11 kilometers per second, and that will produce temperatures of about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is faster and hotter than anything it was exposed to during its test flight in 2014. You can imagine that NASA is going to be eager to recover this, and it's going to splash down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. You can imagine the angst and excitement that they're going to have as they have a U.S. Navy vessel out there to recover this craft and see how it stood up to that re-entry.
You know, I interviewed an Apollo recovery engineer, Milt Heflin, who still does a lot of work with NASA, and he is a consultant on the recovery effort. They brought him in based on his experience. He also is a space shuttle flight director, too, to make sure that they have all their bases covered and that they're good to go and don't have any unforeseen issues. And I interviewed him and plan to air that interview in 26 days. That's why we're not showing it to you tonight. But I just talked to him and got some fascinating feedback on that. And, you know, one of the things he told me is that they brought him in to help them diagnose and look at the issues. How can they do things better? And he looked at it and said the mechanics, the technology is so much more advanced than what they had during the Apollo era that they seem to have all the bases covered. And he told them after analyzing the schematics, hey, there's nothing more I can do for you. This seems perfect in every sense. And there is a very high level of confidence that while they are testing something at 25,000 degrees upon reentry that has never been tested before, that they have put a lot of work on the backside of it, and that they are very optimistic that they have a spacecraft that will easily withstand that kind of heat and that kind of reentry. But that's part of what they are testing. It's the reentry, it's how well it will handle navigation and guidance this far away from Earth once it's circling the moon. Are there any potential hiccups there? As you mentioned, there are mannequins with sensors to test the effects that this will have on humans with Artemis 2 and beyond. And of course, the big one, the execution of the SLS rocket. This has been tested many times on Earth. How many times have we covered and seen an SLS test over the years? But this is the first time we actually see it launch. And a tremendous amount of work, a tremendous amount of money, much more than NASA initially anticipated, went into developing this rocket, the most powerful rocket ever built, surpassing the Saturn V, which took us to the moon more than 50 years ago.
All right, we are now getting a look there at the control center. And Craig, the latest word, again, we were looking at a 1:45 launch time. We haven't seen the 10-minute clock appear, which we expected could happen if we are seeing a 1:45 a.m. launch. And the latest word here from NASA, producer Becca Ollier, if you could give me that again. They're taking a poll to determine if all systems are go, is where we're at, right? Yeah, so they see nothing they see nothing at this point that would, they're doing the poll now, and everything at this point says that they're ready to go. So we should see that countdown window appear soon.
And speaking of time, Chris, there are two different countdowns. This often confuses people because they'll see two different clocks. They eventually converge, as they presumably will here shortly, but you have an L- countdown and a T- countdown. Why are they different? Well, the L- countdown is plain and simple, just a countdown to the point of the beginning of the launch window. It's basically like our clocks, stopwatch,
I see,
that any of us would have counting down to that point. The T- has built-in holds where NASA plans to pause the launch. They know they're going to pause at this particular time to conduct this particular run through, and they have those holds actually plugged into it, which is why the T- countdown will freeze on you at certain points. It will stop at 10 minutes. It will stop even before that because that's planned, and therefore they're going on their own watches knowing what they have planned, like we have commercial breaks, say, during a newscast. We know those are coming. So with that, what you will likely see, if we are in fact targeting a 1:45 a.m. launch, and I think that we are, all indications are leading in that direction, barring some unforeseen events at this point, which are not impossible, you will see a resumption of the countdown that is imminent, probably. I think that we'll see this in a matter of minutes, if not a matter of seconds. So keep an eye on that. Once you see the clock beginning to tick back down, you know that we've proceeded beyond the poll, which is something that always occurs before a launch, and that we are on track to finally launch after a couple of starts and stops, going all the way back to August.
It really has been starts and stops, and hopefully this is the final stoppage. And here is the official tweet from NASA saying that all elements polled are go to proceed with the terminal count. Countdown clock is resuming at T 10 minutes. No constraints to launch is the big takeaway there. So will this go off at 1:45? Maybe not. Let's listen in for a moment here to the control room, to Mission Control.
GLS mainline has been initiated.
Okay.
T-minus 10 minutes and counting.
We are T-minus 10 minutes away from liftoff of Artemis 1. As you can see, the clock is now moving. Let's put that up. T-minus 9 minutes and 47 seconds. The L-minus 15 poll complete.
Show
It went
06:47:44 is the new liftoff time.
Affirm.
Okay.
There we have the clock.
01:47:44. 1:47 a.m. Eastern Time and 44 seconds.
There it is, the new liftoff time, 1:47:44. Down to the second, no surprise.
We went straight into terminal count.
You know, that's an indication that we are there, of course. It means that barring some extraordinarily unexpected
Liftoff
development
now,
at this
9
point,
minutes
that
away.
it will in fact launch. You know, the other hiccups were
So terminal
discovered
count.
hours before this point. In fact,
Control
going back
has
to
been given
August,
over
the
to
issue in August
the GLS,
was with respect
the
to what
ground
NASA
launch
originally
sequencer,
thought was maybe
a
a
computer and
sensor. They
software
weren't
that is
sure.
doing all of the
They were
commanding
failing
and
to
monitoring
properly condition
of the
one
Space
of the
Launch System.
engines in the core stage. The engines need to be cooled or conditioned because you inject super cold fuel into them, and if you don't condition it or cool it before you inject that super cold fuel, it'll warp the engines, or likely would. And that's why they scrubbed the first launch. And then you fast forward to the second launch, which took us to September 2nd or the beginning of September. That was where we had the fuel leak through the seals, and that goes back to they're not using gasoline, they're using super cold hydrogen and oxygen too, which is far more difficult to contain. That can be extraordinarily challenging even for NASA. And that took us forward to what we thought would be a third launch attempt that was pushed back a couple of weeks due to Hurricane Ian, because they had to bring Artemis 1 back into the vehicle assembly building. They brought it back out. Along comes Hurricane Nicole. At that point, they assess the situation and say, well, you know, they don't see a significant issue with leaving it put through the hurricane and then quickly turned into a tropical storm. And then after that, they surveyed the damage. It wound up pushing things back a couple of days. This initially was going to be, depending on how you look at it, Sunday night, early Monday morning. It instead moved to Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning because of some disruptions from hurricane/tropical storm Nicole. Also, the storm did do some damage, by the way, to some of the caulking around the Orion spacecraft that was put into place to smooth it out, to try to prevent some unwanted wind resistance to it. But NASA determined that is not a significant point of concern. They have redundancies built into the system where that's not a disruptor to the launch, which took us to today. And then we got through the fueling. They changed the fueling procedure. First started it earlier to be able to recognize a problem before they did the prior launch attempts, but also to change, to make it, in layman's terms, a little gentler so you're not getting the same pressure spikes, the same amount of pressure on the seals. And sure enough, that certainly prevented any kind of issues we had in early September. And then we had a couple of other hitches that took us presumably from what would have been the 1:04 a.m. launch to now a little after 1:45 a.m. once it does go off, that
Craig,
related to a leaking valve.
Do you think, as we are 6 minutes away now, do you think if this were Artemis 2 and this were manned, with the little glitches we saw earlier tonight, the leaky valve on the launch apparatus there at the base, and also the issue with the radar, do you think they would still have gone ahead with it if there were humans inside that spacecraft that we're looking at?
GLS go for core stage tank.
Possibly, and I'll tell you why possibly in a moment, but I'll hedge on that by saying that it's not for me to say. Charlie Blackwell Thompson, the flight director, is far smarter and more trained on this than me, so we'll certainly defer to her judgment. But possibly, and here's why I say that, because if the issues that we had tonight don't threaten the launch, and upon further testing, the leak of that valve on the mobile launch platform went away. It was resolved, so they decided to move forward. I think that they might have. And also, for reference, there was a previous flight in which there was a leaking valve on the mobile launch platform very similar to the one we had just a couple of hours ago. And the red crew came out and tightened the bolts and were able to resolve it about the same time of the launch that we had tonight. And then that flight took off as planned, or within the window. And that flight was Apollo 11 in July of 1969. And that one certainly had astronauts on it, and that was a critical first for the United States. So NASA's not going to take any undue risk. Absolutely not with its history, what it's learned from in the past, its triumphs, and its failures and tragedies as well. So it will not take undue risks, certainly not with astronauts. But also, given the amount of money that they have invested and time and everything NASA has riding on Artemis 1 without astronauts, it too will exercise a great deal of caution before launching this and making sure that it does not take a risk. Well, it's taking a risk in everything it does. NASA always takes risks, but there's a difference between taking a gamble and taking a risk. And NASA is not going to take any gambles with this, even without any astronauts. And I think that's why we saw the delays going back to August and September, and of course, moving it in for the storm too, for Hurricane Ian.
And as we are now 3 minutes and some 40 seconds away from launch, let's listen in again to Mission Control. And they are saying nothing, of course, as we listen in to this.
At T-minus 3 minutes and 10 seconds, you will hear the go for purge sequence 4. That's a helium purge of the 4 core stage engines downstream of the propellant valve, getting the air and moisture out.
GLS is go for purge sequence 4.
And in just a few seconds, GLS will close the core stage LOX vent, liquid oxygen. The white vapor cloud caused from the super cold gaseous oxygen condensing the water in the atmosphere will disappear. You see it coming out there now. And there it goes, it's closed. LOX vent closed, pressure rising in the core stage LOX tank to flight levels. Coming up in 15 seconds, look for that thrust vector control actuator test. Engines will gimbal. And there they go. The 4 core stage RS-25 engines gimbaling around, testing the ability to steer the rocket into space. They will operate at 109% performance. Each RS-25 throwing down 500,000 pounds of thrust. All 4, 2 million pounds. All together with the boosters, 8.8 million pounds of thrust.
GLS is go for upper stage to internal power.
Now the upper stage has gone to internal power. So power is removed from the rocket's upper stage, the ICPS, and it's been switched to battery power. The same milestone is coming up for the core stage at T-minus 1 minute and 30 seconds.
GLS is go for core stage to internal power.
The rocket's core stage, which houses the 3 flight computers, is now on battery power. So there is no more hold time available because there's no more margin on the batteries. So if we have a hold, we'd have to recycle back to T-minus 10 minutes and recharge those batteries. The count continues. A note now, shortly after liftoff.
1 minute.
Shortly after liftoff, Mission Control Houston will take control of the rocket, and my colleague, Leah Cheshire, will take over commentary. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. Coming up at T-minus 33 seconds, the GLS will hand off control to the ALS. This is the autonomous launch sequencer. On board the rocket, it will take over command and control of the rocket. But the ALS will check, make sure there's no holds coming from the ground up until T-minus 2 seconds.
GLS is go for ALS.
And we are go for ALS. The Space Launch System is now counting down to liftoff of Orion on its maiden voyage to the moon. Launch team can no longer recycle the count. Sound suppressor water now flowing
15.
under the ML. And here we go.
10.
Hydrogen
TLS go
burnoff
for
igniters
four-stage engine
initiated.
start.
7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
Engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters now propelling the vehicle at 128 miles per hour. Hearing good control on the roll from teams in Mission Control Houston. All good calls so far. Now 30 seconds into the flight of Artemis 1. First milestone will be for the vehicle to pass through max Q at about 1 minute and 9 seconds into launch. This is the greatest period of atmospheric force on the rocket. SLS now traveling 607 miles per hour. You're looking at 8.8 million pounds of maximum thrust. Quiet here in the loops in Mission Control. The 4 core stage engines are throttling down ahead of passing through max Q. Now 1 minute, 21 seconds into the flight, traveling at 1,420 miles per hour. The 4 core stage engines are back at maximum thrust. The next major milestone will be for the solid rocket boosters to cut off and jettison at about 2 minutes and 11 seconds into the flight, so about 30 seconds from now. Again, quiet here in Mission Control Houston as teams continue monitoring the flight of Artemis 1. We're now 16 miles downrange from the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, traveling over 2,800 miles per hour. Standing by for solid rocket booster jettison and shortly thereafter. Confirmation that the solid rocket boosters have separated these 177-foot boosters. Now the core stage continues to power the flight of Orion, all 4 RS-25 engines firing, traveling over 3,400 miles per hour, 46 miles downrange. 2 minutes and 36 seconds into the flight. Hearing nominal calls here in Mission Control Houston. We've still got 4 good engines on the core stage. Next up, we'll be looking for the service module fairing to separate. This is 3 15 by 15 foot fairing panels, providing structural support, protecting the service module. Those will separate at about 3 minutes and 11 seconds into flight, and very shortly thereafter will be followed by the launch abort system separation. Just over 3 minutes into the flight of Artemis 1, now traveling over 4,060 miles per hour, 83 miles downrange. We just had confirmation that the service module fairing has separated. And that the launch abort system pyros have fired, separating those from Orion as well. For future crew members,
Okay, getting a little feedback there from Mission Control. And Craig, obviously, if this were a daytime launch, we would have seen more clearly.
We just heard the call for 3 engine press, meaning if SLS were to lose an engine at this point in the mission, we could still achieve a nominal mission. We would just have an extended main engine cutoff time. However, we still have 4 good engines, all at maximum thrust right now, powering the first flight of Artemis at 5,200 miles per hour, 148 miles downrange.
And I believe we're switching, or NASA's switching, to some animation here to show us what these next phases of this early flight will look like. It was incredible to see, Craig. Just one of those things that
4 minutes and 16 seconds into the
absolutely makes you grateful that you are here and part of this wonderful fabric of space exploration that we have that launches from the Florida coast. Incredible to see the solid rocket boosters burning away like that in the night sky.
Absolutely. You know, this certainly brought back memories of the shuttle program, but this has so much more potential and also some parallels to the Apollo program as well. It is remarkable. This was history in the making. This is truly our next giant leap in space. And while we've been to the moon before, this time we're going back with much bigger ambitions. Again, to maintain a permanent presence on the moon, to build a moon colony. Why would we do that? Because we now know the material exists on the moon with the right technology in order to sustain life, with the ability to electrolyze water into breathable air, and also, of course, drinkable water, the ability to convert it into rocket fuel for much longer trips into deep space, which would include a trip to Mars. What's the time frame from that? Well, that remains to be seen. We have to proceed with this, but it's taking us into some very exciting new opportunities in the 2030s and beyond, where the moon will not just be a destination as it was in the Apollo days, but just a stepping stone to so much more. With that, we'll deliver so much more spin-off technology like we saw during the Apollo era. And with this too, this has huge implications for all of us here along the Space Coast, from Titusville all the way through Tampa Bay, St. Pete, and Clearwater, and all places in between, because so many jobs ultimately are fed by this particular program. And keep in mind, NASA and Kennedy Space Center have had lots of ups and downs after the retirement of Apollo. We certainly hit a rut with a good number of jobs lost. It was recovered during the shuttle era, but then the shuttle retired with no glide path to the next big step. Eventually, after being reliant on the Russians to get a ride into space, into low Earth orbit, along came NASA and the commercial players working with NASA and otherwise to get NASA's low Earth orbit business moving again the way that we want it to be, so that NASA can concentrate on the pursuits of deep space. And this is NASA's first big step toward manned space flight in deep space. Again, going to the moon to stay, and then going far, far beyond. This is a critical stepping stone in that direction. And to watch it play out just a couple of minutes ago, and as we speak still en route to the moon, it is extraordinarily exciting for the pursuit of science, of discovery, and certainly what it means for our economy all through Tampa Bay, heading all along the I-4 corridor through Titusville and Kennedy Space Center.
Well said, and I believe we're about 8 minutes. We're about to see the core stage, if we could still see it, and if it wasn't just animation, we would be seeing it 8 minutes, 30 seconds into the flight, 8 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight, which we're approaching. That's the 8-minute mark. In about 20 seconds, we would be seeing the core stage, that large 5-segmented rocket separating from the spacecraft there and falling away. At launch, it weighed some 6.8 million pounds. Of course, it's burned a lot of fuel off by now, but falling away. And we pointed out earlier how that component will actually land in the Pacific Ocean. And there's the animation of the separation. And what you have now is the separation happening at a speed of 17,400 miles per hour at an altitude of almost 550,000 feet. And after this separation, I don't have the terminology, the flares will come out and we will see a burn. It will use its engines that are on board the spacecraft unit there to do a couple of burns, a series of 3 burns, in fact, to get it beyond Earth's orbit. And that will happen about some 51 minutes into the flight. So we won't see that for some time, but it is on its way. It is separated, and again, this will be a 5 or 6 day journey. You know, you think about the expanse of space, and you look out at the moon on a beautiful night. We had a great full moon last week, and sometimes it doesn't seem so distant. And then you take in the journey that this spacecraft is going on, a 5 or 6 day trip, using several burns of its booster rocket there to get to the moon, and you have a new appreciation for just what it took Apollo 11 to make that journey all those years ago. And now here we are on the verge of doing it again. This is the first step. 3 stages, Artemis 1. Artemis 2 will be manned. That's set for 2024, 2 years from now. Artemis 3 will be manned again 2025. That's when we are aiming at putting humans on the surface of the moon again. This was the step tonight, early this morning, to make that happen. Years of planning, 11 years of development of that SLS rocket, numerous delays, as you chronicled for us there, all in the spirit of caution and all knowing that you can't take a risk or a gamble when you've invested this much and you have this much on the line. Yeah. This was a comeback story for NASA, and one that tonight, early this morning on November 16th, will resonate and will be seen as a success and will put NASA and the United States and our ambitions and humanity in its space ambitions back on track for discovering things and accomplishing things that seemed fantastical and incredible just a few short years ago.
Absolutely, and we keep referring to Artemis, and you referred to the Apollo era, the golden age of space travel, when we accomplished with America's can-do spirit something so incredible. Keep in mind there is a connection in terms of the naming of these 2 programs. For those of you who may not know, Apollo, Artemis, they are twins in mythology, and now we have these twin programs that are taking us in to leaps that mankind never would have imagined not that long ago.
Craig Patrick, sitting with us this evening, thank you for your insight. Thank you for your commentary and your vast knowledge of the space program throughout the years. Thank all of you at home for joining us for this historic morning here on November 16th as we watch Artemis 1, the rocket, take off from Cape Canaveral, beginning a return to the moon for humanity. The Good Day crew will be in about 2 hours with much more coverage, and of course we can expect some incredible images coming out in the next few days as we track NASA's mission in the Artemis 1 Return to the Moon program. Thank you for joining us. Have a great morning, and we will see you later.